Hi guys, this is Weasel for PokerVIP.com. Today we're going to be talking about finding folds at the lower limits. And this can easily be one of the most important factors in achieving a high win rate at the Microstakes games. It's quite difficult to think of folding as something that actually makes us money, because obviously when we fold it means we're losing the hand and we technically lose money. But we can certainly lose less money than we would have if we decided to continue in that particular spot. So in a way, folding does actually make us money, because if in a certain situation where it's a close spot, we are able to find a fold, yet we know our opponent, if he was in exactly the same situation, would not be able to find a fold, there's actually going to be a considerable difference between our win rate and our opponent's win rate, and this is exactly where our profits come from. So in this video we're going to look at spots where we can increase our win rate by successfully finding folds in perhaps some close situations. It's going to be a two-part series, and in the first part we're going to focus primarily on river situations where we are able to fold. The first tool we can use in analyzing how good we are at calling on the river or finding folds on the river is our river call efficiency stat. So it's recommended at this stage that you open your tracking software and you have a look at your river call efficiency stat. So what exactly is river call efficiency? What does it tell us? River call efficiency is a ratio, and it describes the amount of money won compared to the amount of money invested on the river. So if we were to have a river call efficiency of 1, it means for every dollar we invest on the river, we have a return of $1. If we had a river call efficiency of 2, it would mean for every dollar we invest on the river, we make back $2 in that particular case. In terms of game theory and balanced play, our river call efficiency should actually be 1, because assume that we actually make money with our river calls and we have a river call efficiency of above 1, it actually means we're not calling wide enough to justify the pot odds we're getting on the river. However, we're not interested in playing a balanced game, we're not interested in game theory, we're mainly interested in playing an exploitative game, especially at the lower limits where our opponents have very readable tendencies. So if we have a river call efficiency of 1 at the lower limits, it means we're actually playing pretty badly on the river and we're not really making any money with our river calls. So if we can play exploitatively on the river, we should expect our river call efficiency to be somewhere between 1.4 and 1.6. So it's recommended you check this in your tracking software now. If your river call efficiency is below 1.4, it may indicate that you have a problem in terms of facing river bets and potentially calling down too wide. In some rarer cases, you may find that your river call efficiency is above 1.6, maybe 1.8, maybe even 2. That would generally indicate that you have the opposite problem and you are playing too tight on the river and you're being too nitty with your river calls. So if you find your river call efficiency is below 1.4, then this video is going to be for you. We're going to be looking at some common situations where players call too much on the river. And the most important factor in fixing this problem is understanding what the population tendencies are at your limits on the river. So we'll look at two main situations where we should be able to make exploitative decisions at the lower limits. The first is facing a 3-barrel. The key thing to understand here is that the average triple barrel range is heavily unbalanced. It's going to be weighted towards value. We'll come back to the exact frequencies when we look at some specific hands, but for now just keep in mind that while our opponents may occasionally be bluffing when they fire 3 barrels, there's a good chance they are not bluffing as much as they should be if they were playing a correct game of poker. So for the most part we can assume that when our opponent 3 barrels, he's going to show up with part of his value range. The way we can exploit this is by folding all of our bluff catchers. Again, we're going to come back to exactly what we mean by a bluff catcher when we look at a hand example. But the main value of a bluff catcher is that it wins if our opponent is bluffing. And if our opponent is not bluffing frequently enough, then any of our bluff catchers are going to have very limited value. So the way we exploit an unbalanced river range, which is weighted towards value, is we very simply fold all of our bluff catchers. To continue, we must at least beat the weakest hand in opponent's value range. So we're going to look at some examples and we're going to define these terms a little better in case this is unclear. So here in this hand we have Queen King We'll briefly comment on the action, but we're mainly interested in the river play. So we call pre-flop against a cutoff open, which seems pretty standard. Flop top pair, top kicker. Should be check calling this flop. And we should probably be at least check calling 2 when we have a decent top pair hand. Our opponent double barrels, we call. The river is a jack. Our opponent fires a decent sized third barrel. So let's define a few of the terms that we mentioned in the slide. So the first one is our opponent's value range. So very simply, by his value range we mean the hands that he is choosing to bet for value, seeing as he thinks that he could get called by worse hands over 50% of the time. So in terms of value range, let's exclude bluffs for the moment. What do you think our opponent is value betting here? What kind of range would you give him? What would you say the weakest hand in his value range is? So maybe pause the video, have a think. I would say in this spot that the absolute weakest hand he could possibly be doing this with is probably something like ace queen. And I think most of his value range is going to be stronger than that. We're going to be seeing things like 7x type hands, pocket 2s, maybe one combo of pocket queens. I think it's not that likely opponent will 3-barrel something like queen king in this particular spot. It's very hard for him to get called by worse. Obviously queen jack now gets there on this particular river card, even pocket jacks gets there. So the next weakest hand that could potentially call our opponent is something like queen 10. And with a hand like queen 10, the kicker doesn't even play because it's a jack kicker, which is already on the board, so it would be queens and 7s with jack kicker. So basically queen 10 and weaker are all equivalent. So having queen 10, pretty much the same as having queen 3 in this particular spot. It's very hard for our opponents to get called by worse here. So I'd say ace queen, maybe, is probably the weakest hand in his value range. So in this particular case, if we're saying his value range is ace queen plus, we don't beat any of his value range. In other words, if he is value betting here, we're going to lose 100% of the time. The only way we can win this hand is if our opponent is bluffing, and he certainly could be bluffing some percentage of the time. So this is why we refer to the hand as a bluff catcher. If our opponent's value betting, we always lose. If our opponent's bluffing, we generally win. So assuming we had a hand that actually beat some of his value range, let's say we have something like queen jack here, and we beat maybe stuff like ace queen that he's value betting, we don't have a pure bluff catcher anymore because we actually beat some of our opponent's value range. But with holding a hand like queen king, we can refer to this particular spot as a bluff catcher. So if the only time we win is when our opponent is bluffing, and we lose every time he's value betting, then the only thing we really care about is how frequently is he bluffing compared to how frequently he is value betting. In terms of the bluff to value ratio he should be using, we can calculate this by taking a look at the pot odds that we're getting. We can see Poker Tracker 4 says we need 28% equity to call. For our opponent, this means that if he was playing a balanced strategy, which he's very unlikely to be doing so at the lower limits, he should be bluffing here about 28% of the time, and he should be value betting about 72% of the time. While our opponent may be bluffing some percentage of the time, it's extremely unlikely he's bluffing 28% of the time here. In fact, the average player is probably bluffing about 5% of the time here, and in some cases there are many players who don't ever 3-barrel bluff. So if our opponent was bluffing more than 28%, then we'd probably think about calling anything that fitted into the category of bluff catcher, something like queen king for example. But seeing as our opponent is probably bluffing less than this 28%, we can fold absolutely any hand which does not beat the weakest hand in our opponent's value range. In other words, if the weakest hand our opponent is value betting is ace queen, we need to have at least something like queen jack in order to think about calling this third barrel. Keep in mind that this is not necessarily a balanced strategy. We will end up perhaps folding the river slightly too much compared to how we should be folding the river if we were playing a game theory optimal strategy, but that's the whole point. We are slightly over folding the river as an exploitative line, given that the average player at these limits 3 barrels with a range that's heavily weighted towards value. So we're going to look through some other examples. We won't spend as long on these examples because hopefully the principles are pretty clear. The questions we need to ask ourselves when we look at these hands is, do we just hold a bluff catcher, or do we beat some of our opponent's value range? And if we just hold a bluff catcher, it's nearly always going to be a fold at the lower limits. And by lower limits, I mean at least 25 in L and below, but probably 50 in L and below, depends on the network to an extent. And also, against many players at even higher limits, they just don't have a very balanced 3-barrel range. We can make some pretty big folds in the spot. So here, Queen King, we call an ISO raise from the big blind with Queen King suited. We should at least check call the flop. As mentioned, it's probably somewhat similar to the previous hand. We should call the turn with a decent top pair, so we call at least two streets. In terms of our opponent's value range here, he's probably not value betting King Jack in this particular spot. So we actually have an exploitative fold here. Again, we just hold a bluff catcher. Our opponent is 3-barreling. We can get away with folding here. If we felt our opponent was value betting stuff like King Jack, King 10, then we should think about calling. But if we think that his value range starts at something like Ace King, then we should seriously fold in this particular spot. So Ace 10 of spades. So we call a cutoff open from the big blinds. Again, we flop a top pair. So our default game plan should usually be to call 2 streets unless the turn sizing is super large. And our opponent bets on the river. And in terms of his value range, it's very unlikely he's value betting something like Ace 9 here. Maybe he has Ace Queen, but he also has a whole bunch of 2-pair combos. He has maybe Queen 10 for the straight, he has some flushes. Should be a pretty straightforward fold at these limits. Ace 7 of spades in the big blind. Do we defend versus a 2.4x open? Again, we flop a top pair, so we're looking to check call 2 streets. And again on the river, this is interesting because some of you might think that when we spike trips on the river that it dramatically increases the strength of a hand, but in reality it doesn't really increase the strength of a hand that much. It's true that our opponent has less combinations of aces, but the relative hand strength that we have doesn't necessarily change that much, because if he's barreling something like trips, which obviously makes a full house in the river if he has a set of 5s or jacks, or if he's barreling a better ace, our range doesn't improve at all against that particular range. In other words, if he had us beat on the turn, he very often still has us beat on the river. The only exception to this is stuff like Jack 8, Jack 5, 2-pair combos, but these are generally not going to fire the river when they get counterfeited, because obviously Jack 8 now becomes something like aces and jacks. Jack 5 becomes aces and jacks also. So despite the fact that we improve the absolute strength of a hand, the relative strength of a hand doesn't really improve in this spot, and we should be able to fold trip aces here. Because if you think about our opponent's range, we still only beat a bluff. We don't really beat anything else. Any ace is usually going to be better than our hand. Keep in mind that our kicker does not play in this particular spot, so if our opponent has something like ace 4, then we chop. In this particular case, we don't win, because the hand we are playing at the moment is trip aces with Jack 8 kicker. As 7 does not play in this particular case. So it's actually a very good spot to make a fold. Some of you would not fold here because you might feel that once you hit trip aces, your hand has improved so much that you can't fold, but keep in mind the most important thing here is relative hand strength, not absolute hand strength. Ace Jack offsuit, we defend against the button min raise. Again, we flop top pair, so we're going to be calling 2 streets generally. Not a great turn card for us, but we shouldn't necessarily check fold the turn just yet. River should be a pretty trivial check fold. In this particular case, our opponent's probably not value betting a worse ace. We should be able to get away from a hand in this particular case. Ace 9, same kind of situation. Hopefully you can see the pattern here. We reach the river. Our opponent bets. And in this particular case, we don't necessarily want to be misled by our opponent's sizing. Just because he's making it pretty small and less than half pot doesn't necessarily mean that he now has stuff like ace 8 offsuit in his range and our kicker's good. Especially when you give the board texture some consideration, because one thing we should notice here is there are 4 to straight out there. In other words, our opponent may bet smaller with something like ace queen, ace jack now, because he realizes value is thin. We're going to be less inclined to call when there's a 4 to straight out there. So although we get better pot odds in general versus smaller bets, there's also another problem in that it's actually less likely our opponent's bluffing when he bets small. In other words, we might be good less often against a small bet, than we would be against a shove, where he polarizes his range. He doesn't really represent ace-queen anymore. He mainly represents 4x hands. So we shouldn't necessarily assume specifically on the river, in terms of exploitative play, that we should call down much wider if our opponent's bet is smaller. We still want to think about what his value range is, because in this particular case, yes, he does bet smaller, but that probably just means he has more value hands and he's less likely to be bluffing. You will find some river situations where it's actually correct to call a large bet, but it's not correct to call a small bet because opponent's range is going to be much more value oriented. Ace-2 offsuit. Again, we defend in the big blind versus 2.5x open. Should be a pretty standard call, so if you're not defending this from the big blind, then you're playing too tight. Again, we're going to be calling down 2 streets, and again, we make trips here, but if we think about our opponent's value range, there isn't really any worse hands he could be value betting in this particular spot. He's not value betting a queen x or something. We only beat bluffs here. Of course, we may need to make some adjustments if we find our opponent is 3-barreling very aggressively, and we know for a fact that he'll just 3-barrel any club draw here, for example, or even 3-barrel garbage if he's a maniac. But by default, we should assume that it's a good spot to fold here. Our opponent is going to be heavily weighted towards value, and we lose to his value range. King 3. We defend against a UTG min raise. It's a little bit loose, but we do get an amazing price in the big blind for a min raise. Our opponent bets, we check call. We should check call the turn again, and then think about folding the river. Especially when he jams, I think there's no way we can call in this particular spot. Ace 5. Check flop, check call turn usually, and then fold river. Obviously the 5 is meaningless because our hand is aces and 8s with queen kicker. The 5 doesn't play in this particular case. So we should just fold. So these principles don't just apply to facing a 3-barrel. We also want to take the same principles and apply them to other situations. In particular situations where, according to population tendencies, our opponents do not have a balanced range and they are heavily weighted towards value, allowing us to make exploitative folds with our bluff catchers. So one of these lines is facing a river raise. Most players at the lower limits basically never bluff raise a river. In other words, if they're raising the river, they're going to be heavily weighted towards value. We can apply the same logic where if we don't beat any of the hands in our opponent's value range, we can think about making a pretty straightforward fold. So against unknowns, we should basically assume any river raise, heavily weighted towards value, and as a result we can fold all of our bluff catchers in this particular spot. So same as before, let's have a look at some examples. So here we have ace-4 of hearts in the big blinds, and we flop 2 pairs, so pretty reasonable hand, and we decide to lead here given the drawy texture and also given that our opponent looks like a weaker player, so we don't want to miss value in this particular case. 7 is reasonably safe, we should bet. Facing the river raise, see our opponent makes 28 big blinds, we decide to fold in this particular case. This is actually a pretty close spot because we can actually think of some hands in our opponent's value range that we do actually beat. For example, it's possible he could have some kind of 2-pair combo. For example, he could have something like 9-7 or 9-5 or 7-5. These are not super likely though, because 7-5 probably doesn't get past a flop, 9-5 probably doesn't get past a turn, and 9-7, it's probably only going to be 9-7 suited in this particular case unless our opponent is opening really wide and there's only going to be 2 combos of 9-7 suited. In other words, if our opponent does have 2-pair, it's much more likely to be something like ace-9, ace-7, or ace-5. In other words, the majority of his 2-pair combos beat us. So while we could maybe think of 1 or 2 combos of worse hands that might raise for value in this particular spot, seeing as we're only just about beating some of the absolute weakest hands in his value range, is still more or less just a bluff catcher, and it's going to be a good spot to find a fold. So if we assume that the weakest hand in our opponent's value range is, some kind of hand like ace-5, we probably don't necessarily want to call the very next hand up. Like if our opponent's weakest hand here is ace-5, we don't necessarily want to call ace-7, but we should at least consider calling ace-7. Whereas if we had something like ace-9 or above here, then I think we are outside of the realms where we just have a bluff catcher, because our opponent could be raising any worse aces up combo on the river here. So we should probably call with ace 9 and then seriously think about folding ace 4, ace 5. Ace 7 is probably going to be super borderline in this particular spot. So moving on to the next hand, ace king. And we call here, which is okay. Squeezing might be a slightly stronger option. And we decide to lead this flop. And the best option might even be to check the flop. I think it really depends what kind of hands, what kind of stats we have on our opponent. I think there's probably a reason why I played the hand this way. Regardless, we're mainly interested in the river play. So we bet, and then we fire the river, and our opponent jams. It's very unlikely he's doing this with ace queen. He probably would not even do this with ace king. In other words, his range is going to be stuff like 9s, 5s, river 2x hands. Of course, he can be bluffing, but again, if we check the pot odds, we can see that he theoretically needs to be bluffing 30% of the time, and in reality, if he does have any kind of bluff range, it's going to be more like 5% of the time in this particular spot. We just hold a bluff catcher, we can make a pretty easy fold in this spot. Jacks, we ISO raise pre-flop against a limper, and we see bet the flop, we have an overpair. The 9 doesn't change that, we should bet again, our opponent calls. River is a queen, which is obviously not a great card for extracting value. However, there aren't too many queen x hands in our opponent's range. It's more likely he has some kind of 7x. So I go for a thin value bet here on the river, hoping to get called by 7x or a 9x. But of course, our opponent may have some queen x, and he may have some backdoor flushes. He may also have slow rolled us with something like pocket 7s. So there's absolutely no way we can be calling the river raise here. And sometimes we are going to get bluffed. We're going to get bluffed in this spot by something like ace 5 of diamonds. But if we never get bluffed in the river, we're actually probably playing a pretty bad game of poker. Like, in order to play correct poker, we have to allow ourselves to be bluffed in this kind of spot. Because even if this guy has something like ace 5 of diamonds, he's just not going to show up with a hand frequently enough for us to have a profitable call. So sometimes if you call here, you'll call and you'll win when an opponent shows a busted draw. But that doesn't mean it's going to be the correct option in the long run. It's going to be much better to fold here overall. King Queen. We call versus an MP open, which is fine. We flop top 2. Our opponent checks back though. Decide to lead the turn. Our opponent calls. The 4 to straight gets there on the river, which is unfortunate. We go for a very thin value bet here because it's possible we can get called by some worse 2-pair combos, maybe even 1 pair if our opponent's fishy. When he raises, he very likely has a jack. We just have a bluff catcher again because he's not raising something like king 10 for value here, or king 9, or 9-10. His value raising range is jack x, so we only beat a bluff in this particular spot. We can find a fold. Ace king. We call pre-flop against a 3x open. Our opponent c-bets. We decide to float with our 2 overs and backdoor draw. Spike a king on the river, which is great. Our opponent checks back, so by this stage we usually have a value bet against basically 7s through queens we should be able to extract value from. Our opponent might not have too many combos of hearts, maybe he'd double barrel those. We also have the heart blocker with the ace of hearts. But when he raises, we have to really reevaluate here. He's very unlikely to be raising something like pocket 8s here, it just doesn't make sense. He's not going to be raising a worse king. His raising range is going to be flushes, maybe some rivered 5x hands, and possibly some boats that he slow played on the turn if he decided he wants to get tricky and check back something like pocket 5s or pocket 6s on the turn. This probably won't happen too often though. So we should be very comfortable folding in this particular spot, and if we don't fold in these spots, this is how our river call efficiency ends up getting pretty low. King 4, we call a min raise from the big blind against the button open, which is very standard. Opponent checks back, so we should have 2 streets of value against stuff like 10x, pocket jacks, etc. Our opponent calls, bet the river, he raises. Most likely thing is he's rivered maybe some kind of 2 pairs, something like 10-8, that would make sense. Or maybe he decides to check back something like king 8 suited on the flop, probably has some kind of 2 pair, and he could of course have things like 7-9, maybe he'd see better flop with those. Either way, we again just have a bluff catcher. Our opponent's not raising something like pocket queens for value here. He's just raising, at least he has to have a better king than ours to raise in this particular spot. And a lot of guys would just call with their king x hands in the river, so it looks like 2 pair plus in this particular case as his value range. Here we have ace queen, and we open from the small blind, big blind calls, decide to go for a check call on the flop, which is pretty reasonable with a non-vulnerable second pair type hand. Turn and river, we should have value bets though. River, we still decide to value bet, even though the card's obviously not great for us. Our opponent might bet some of his heart draws on the flop though, so maybe he doesn't have too many of those. But again, once he raises, we have to reevaluate here. He could be bluffing, of course. He could have something like ace-jack and be bluffing, but he's probably not doing that 23% of the time. He's going to be weighted towards value here. We should have a pretty easy fold, especially with something like a second pair type hand. Ace-4, we open raise a small blind, we flop trips. We decide to bet. I think probably checking is completely fine here. It's probably a way ahead, way behind situation, so we don't really need to bet. We go for thin value on the turn. We don't want to isolate ourselves against stronger hands given our kicker issues. Although actually, trip ace is king queen. We obviously tie now with ace-jack, ace-10 and lower in this particular case. But in order to get called by something like a king x, because obviously if we just chop with any ace-x hands, then we need to be targeting stuff like king x in this particular case. So that's why we go for the small value bet on the turn. We don't want him to fold stuff like king x hands or gut shots. River's obviously a bad card. And we go for some very thin value. And the opponent raises, so we fold in this particular case. Ace-queen. Again we call, but we could squeeze. Squeezing's perfectly legitimate in this spot. It depends on who's in the big blind to an extent as well. Full way, we don't really need to slow play, so we decide to lead out in this particular case. Go for value again on the turn. River, we go for value. Obviously, the river card's not great for a couple of reasons. Obviously, our opponent could have a flush. The other reason it's not great is if our opponent doesn't have a flush, he's going to be scared that we have a flush. So it's harder for him to call with stuff like worse queens or like pocket jacks or something. So we go for thin value, but we have to bet fold here. Our opponent is very unlikely to raise the worst queen at this stage when he knows we could potentially have a flush or a full house or something. So really at this point we're looking at flushes and we're looking at slow played boats. Like our opponent could have something like pocket sevens here. So we should make the folds. Okay, so we've looked at two of the main spots, but one of the tough things about analyzing river call efficiency is there are so many situations that can make our river call efficiency not very good. So we're just going to review a couple of other situations, and it's recommended that you try and use your tracking software to filter for these situations and see if you're maybe calling down too wide in this situation also. So an interesting filter to run would be looking at pot size bets or over bets on the river. Can be especially interesting to analyze this if you have some of the advanced tools such as the Notecaddy scatter graph, where you can see the correlation between your opponent's bet sizing and the strength of his hand. Overbetting the river is a very useful tool for getting your opponents to fold at these limits. We shouldn't then necessarily assume that just because it's a very good way of getting your opponents to fold that everyone is going around overbet bluffing the river. In fact, for the vast majority of players at the lower limits, a pot size river bet or a river overbet is simply just going to be a huge tell that that player is very, very strong, is going to be weighted towards value, and as a result we want to be folding anything that's a bluff catcher. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't use it. It's actually a very useful tool. That's why we can get so many folds, is because it's perceived as so strong at the lower limits. So if we recognize our opponent has a capped range based on the line he takes, then we can think about overbetting river, but we don't want to then assume that everyone else is doing the same thing, because they're really not. So it might be interesting to run a filter for pot size bets or overbets on the river, see what kind of hands we're paying off with, see how frequently our opponent is showing up with a bluff, how frequently he's showing up with a value hand. And I'd imagine we'd see that in most cases the majority of opponents are weighted towards value when they make a large river bet. If you find someone that's not weighted towards value and has a ton of bluffs when they overbet, that's the kind of player you want to take a note on. And against those players, you can now think about calling with some of your bluff catchers, which would be correct strategy. Once we get to higher limits like 200 NL plus, we can't obviously fold all of our bluff catchers in a river situation, because most of our opponents are going to be realizing that they can't just have a range that's heavily weighted towards value in some spots. It's too easy to exploit. So once you start getting to higher limits, you have to start calling down with some bluff catchers, so our opponent is not incentivized to just have a hugely wide bluff range, knowing that we're just going to fold all of our bluff catchers. So pot size bets or over bets. Another interesting line to filter for might be the bet check bet line. So our opponent bets a flop, he checks back the turn and then fires a river. In most cases this won't be a bluff. Some players do mix this line in as a bluff, so We might consider calling some of our bluff catches in this particular case, but in the vast majority of cases, players usually take this line for thin value rather than a bluff. If they wanted to bluff, they would usually double barrel the turn. So when they go for a bet, check, bet, it's usually going to be some kind of thin value hand that they pot controlled on the turn. So again, put your opponent on a value range. Keep in mind that his value range might be a little bit weaker in this particular case compared to a situation where he three barrels. So we should be able to call more hands in this particular situation. We're going to have more hands which beat our opponent's value range. But again, run some filters for your particular site and against your particular opponents. Have a look at whether they're weighted towards value or not, or whether there's quite a lot of bluff going on. And have a look at your calling range as well. Just make sure that you're not calling down too wide. Once you run this particular filter, it's good to also check your river call efficiency for this particular situation as well. You might find some particular lines that you run, your river call efficiency is very low for that particular line. While it's very easy to weight your opponent's range towards value if they triple barrel, this isn't the only situation that affects our river call efficiency. We're probably also interested in reviewing situations where our opponents double barrel the turn and river. Maybe the flop gets checked through and they double barrel turn and river. Maybe they call our flop c-bet in position, and then when we miss our turn c-bet, they decide to go for a double barrel. So have a look at these spots, have a look at your calling range, have a look at your river call efficiency, have a look at what the average player is showing up with, and try and establish whether they are weighted towards value or weighted towards bluffs. So hopefully everything we have discussed makes sense. If you have any questions or any comments, then please post in the comment section below the video. And I look forward to catching you in part 2 of this 2-part series here at Folding at the Microstakes. Thanks very much for watching. This has been Weasel for PokerVIP.com.